Well, I think the evidence shows otherwise. I think the evidence shows that Ukraine is winning the war because since the initial Russian invasion, well, I mean, the initial Russian invasion was actually in 2014, but since the Russian invasion ramped up in 2022, Russia did make some immediate gains. But since then, there's hardly been any change on the battlefield. I mean, Russian troops are advancing at a pace slower than troops were on the Western Front in World War One.
Well, you're an expert and an authority on military power. You have been very critical of President Trump, both with respect to the war in Ukraine and also his relationship with Vladimir Putin. In the past few days, he has changed his tune, says he is not happy with Putin, says he has authorized shipping some defensive missiles to Ukraine. He's talked about other elements, other issues, as well as a potential things for the United States to do. Are you reassured by this? Is he seeing the light?
I am surprised, and I am, positively surprised because my concern was that given Trump's long history of pro-Russian and anti-Ukrainian sentiments, my concern was that he was simply going to abandon Ukraine, and I think those concerns, only increased in February when he had that famous shouting match with President Zelensky in the Oval Office, and it really looked like the U.S. was abandoning its support for Ukraine. And now I think things look a little bit different after this week, where President Trump announced that he was going to be allowing our European allies to buy weapons that they will then ship on to Ukraine, including evidently Patriot missiles, which is something that the Ukrainians really need because they are under very heavy attack from Russian drones and missiles. And Trump also announced that he was going to impose, crushing 100% tariffs on Russia and its trade partners if Putin doesn't make peace in 50 days, i.e., by September 2nd. Now, it's a pleasant surprise, and it's something that I think Vladimir Putin was not banking on because I think Putin was counting on Trump to abandon Ukraine and therefore let Putin try to achieve his objectives on the ground. And that objective, of course, is to turn Ukraine into a Russian colony. And I think now the prospects for Ukraine are looking up because it seems like the United States is not abandoning Ukraine after all. When he came into office this second time around, there were a lot of expectations, including from folks like John Bolton, Trump's former national security advisor, that Trump would actually exit NATO because he has been so scathing about the alliance. But the European powers have basically been able to win him over with these pledges of spending 5% of GDP on defense, a lot of which is smoke and mirrors, but it satisfied Trump. And he's really come around. And so, what he's doing right now is not as good as I would like to see. I think there's a lot more we can do, and we can talk about that. But while it's not as good as one could hope, it's a lot better than what I had feared.
Hi, I'm Janice, and I am co-founder of Jews United for Democracy and Justice, as well as the America at a Crossroads weekly virtual town hall series. If you like this video, don't just watch. Head over to our website where you can subscribe for early access to new programs, see our upcoming schedules, and participate in our weekly live streams. You can also connect directly with our guests live on Zoom. Head over to JewsUnitedForDemocracy.org. Thanks for watching.
There are a lot of people, including Vice President Vance, who have been warning against endless war, as they call it, warning that there might be nuclear war as a result of what's happening in Ukraine. And as he and the president lectured Zelensky in that incident you mentioned in the White House, they have said that Ukraine just can't win this war in Ukraine.
Well, I think the evidence shows otherwise. I think the evidence shows that Ukraine is winning the war because since the initial Russian invasion, well, I mean, the initial Russian invasion was actually in 2014, but since the Russian invasion ramped up in 2022, Russia did make some immediate gains. But since then, there's hardly been any change on the battlefield. I mean, Russian troops are advancing at a pace slower than troops were on the Western Front in World War One. And for very minimal gains, Putin is paying a very heavy price. I mean, Russia has lost roughly 1 million troops killed or wounded, huge numbers of tanks, artillery pieces, armored personnel carriers, aircraft, ships, all these other types of military hardware. So Russia, and despite all that, Ukraine continues to function as a pro-Western democracy. I mean, I think anybody who's been to Ukraine during the war, as I have been, comes away incredibly impressed by the resilience of the Ukrainian people. And that, sure, there is the war going on in the front line, but even in cities like Kiev or Odessa or elsewhere, you get air raids. You have to go to the bomb shelters, and apartment buildings get blown up. But nevertheless, life goes on. The streets are still crowded. People go to work. People go to cafes and restaurants. And so Ukraine has been surviving this war. And even though Russia has amassed something like 600,000 troops in and around Ukraine, I still don't see much evidence that the Russians are on the verge of any kind of breakthrough. And in fact, I think one of the most significant developments that we've seen in the last few years has been the development of Ukrainian defense industry. The Ukrainians are on track to produce more than 4 million drones this year, which is an amazing number, considering that the entire United States, we're a much larger, much richer country. The entire United States is only going to produce about 100,000 drones this year. The Ukrainians are going to produce over 4 million. And of course, the Russians are producing their own drones, but basically the prevalence of those drones over the battlefield have essentially frozen the front lines and made it almost impossible for troops to advance in either direction. So, I mean, that's bad in a sense because it means that Ukraine is not recovering the 20% of the territory that the Russians have occupied. But it's also good in the sense that it means that the Russians are unlikely to advance much beyond the 20% that they currently control. And so I think that could potentially set the basis for a ceasefire down the road. But first, I think we're going to have to see what happens with Putin's big summer offensive, because he has to be convinced he is not going to win the war before he's going to negotiate seriously. And up until now, he's still been thinking that he can win the war.
America at a crossroads next week. It's going to be Paul Maslin and Mike Murray with Pat Morrison. What does Washington's chaos portend for the 2026 midterm? It's never too early to talk about those. Thanks again to everybody for listening and watching. See you next week.